The war was supposed to bring freedom. That is what the people of rural France believed in the summer of 1944. When American trucks rolled through their villages, people cheered in the streets. Children ran beside the soldiers. Women waved and threw flowers. For many families, it felt like the nightmare of occupation was finally over. But in one quiet farming village in Brittany, something happened only a few days after liberation that would be hidden for 80 years. A story written in a letter. A letter that no one was meant to read until history finally came looking for it. And when that letter was opened decades later, it revealed a moment of sacrifice that still echoes through the lives of the people who survived it. Tonight, we are going back to that moment. A moment when war did not look like battlefields or tanks or armies moving across maps. Instead, it looked like a farmhouse in the dark. A frightened family, and a mother who made a decision no parent should ever have to make. Before we continue, take a second to support the channel. If you enjoy deep war stories and hidden history that most documentaries never talk about, make sure you like the video and subscribe to Clandestine Combat. Your support helps us keep uncovering the stories that history left buried. Now, imagine the scene. August 1944. The countryside of Brittany is quiet again after weeks of chaos. Just days earlier, Allied forces had pushed German troops out of the region. For 4 long years, the people here had lived under occupation. Soldiers in the streets, curfews at night, food shortages, fear that never really went away. Then suddenly, the Americans arrived. To the villagers, they looked like heroes straight out of a movie. Tall young men in dusty uniforms riding trucks and tanks with white stars painted on the sides. They handed out chocolate and cigarettes. They waved to the crowds. For families who had suffered through years of war, the sight of those soldiers meant something powerful. It meant hope. Among the villagers watching from the roadside that week was a girl standing beside her parents outside their small farmhouse. She had never seen American soldiers before. Like everyone else in the village, she smiled and waved as the convoy passed. She had no way of knowing that just 3 nights later, 2 of those same soldiers would return to her home after dark. And what would happen next would be written down in a letter meant for no one except the future. The village where this story begins was small, the kind of place where everyone knew each other. A handful of farms, narrow dirt roads, and fields stretching toward the horizon. Life there had always been quiet before the war arrived. Families worked the land, raised animals, and lived simple lives that rarely changed from one season to the next. But the war changed everything when German forces occupied France in 1940. Villages like this one suddenly found themselves living under rules written by a foreign army. Soldiers patrolled the roads. Supplies were taken. Radios were banned. Even small acts of resistance could lead to arrest or worse. For 4 long years, the people of Brittany learned to live carefully, speaking quietly and trusting only those they knew well. So when Allied forces finally pushed into the region in the summer of 1944, the sense of relief was overwhelming. Church bells rang again. Flags appeared in windows that had been hidden away for years. Families gathered in the streets to watch the convoys roll past. To them, these soldiers represented the end of fear. Among those watching that day was the young woman from the farmhouse. She stood beside her parents, near the edge of the road, as American vehicles passed by. The soldiers waved back, smiling as children ran beside the trucks asking for candy. For a brief moment, it felt like normal life might return. But war has a way of leaving shadows behind, even when the fighting moves somewhere else. 3 nights later, the village was quiet again. The celebration had faded. Most of the soldiers had already moved on toward the next front. Only a few units remained scattered around the countryside as the Allied advance continued deeper into France. At the farmhouse, the young woman and her parents had already gone inside for the night. The fields outside were dark and silent. There were no streetlights here, only the faint glow of the moon over the farmland. Then, suddenly, the quiet was broken. Headlights appeared on the road. An American military jeep slowed near the farmhouse before coming to a stop. 2 soldiers climbed out. Even from a distance, something about their movements looked unsteady. They had been drinking. Inside the farmhouse, the family heard the vehicle arrive. At first they thought it might be soldiers asking for directions or supplies, something that had already happened a few times since the liberation. But what happened next would quickly make it clear that this visit was very different. The soldiers walked toward the door, and then one of them knocked. Inside the farmhouse, the family froze when they heard the knock. It was late, much later than anyone in the village expected visitors. The father looked toward the door, confused, more than afraid at first. Allied soldiers had been welcomed in many homes across the countryside during those first days of liberation. Farmers offered water, bread, sometimes even wine. It was a way of saying thank you. But something about the knocking felt different. It was loud, impatient. The father stepped toward the door, while his wife and daughter stood a few steps behind him. When he opened it, 2 American soldiers were standing outside in the darkness. Their uniforms were dusty. Their rifles hung from their shoulders, and the smell of alcohol was impossible to miss. One of the soldiers spoke first. His voice was slurred, the words heavy and careless. The father did not understand much English, but the tone alone made him uneasy. The men were not asking for food or directions. They were demanding something. Then one of the soldiers raised his rifle. The shot exploded into the night. The bullet tore through the air and ripped the cap off the father's head, missing his skull by only inches. The message was clear. It was not meant to kill him. It was meant to warn him. Inside the farmhouse, the young woman gasped. Her mother grabbed her arm instinctively, pulling her slightly behind her as both soldiers stepped closer to the doorway. They were not looking at the father anymore. They were looking at the daughter. In that moment, every person in the room understood what the soldiers wanted. The father stood frozen, knowing that any attempt to fight them would likely end with a second shot, one that would not miss. The rifles were still in their hands. The soldiers pointed toward the girl. The mother turned slowly and looked at her daughter. She was only 19 years old. Just days earlier, she had been standing on the road cheering the very same army that now stood in her doorway. For a few seconds, no one spoke. War had already taken many things from families across Europe. Homes, fathers, brothers, sons. But in that moment, standing in the doorway of that farmhouse, the mother realized that war was about to take something else, unless she stopped it. And in the silence of that dark farmhouse, she made a decision that would shape the rest of her daughter's life. She stepped forward. The mother moved slowly, placing herself between the soldiers and her daughter. She did not shout. She did not beg. Instead, she looked directly at the 2 men standing in the doorway, and then turned briefly toward the frightened girl behind her. In that moment, a silent understanding passed between them, something that did not need words. The soldiers watched her carefully. She spoke only a few quiet words in French to her daughter, telling her to stay inside the house. The girl shook her head at first, terrified of what her mother was about to do, but the woman's expression did not change. There was a calm determination in her face, the kind that only appears when someone knows there is no other choice. Then the mother turned back toward the soldiers and nodded. She stepped outside. The night air was cold and still. Behind her, the farmhouse door slowly closed, leaving her daughter and husband inside the dark kitchen. The 2 soldiers gestured toward the open fields beyond the road. Their rifles were still in their hands. They began walking. Inside the house, the daughter stood frozen near the table, staring at the closed door. Her father moved toward the window, but stopped himself. There was nothing he could do. If he stepped outside, the rifles would speak again. So the family waited. Minutes passed. In the distance, somewhere beyond the fields, there were faint voices, then silenced again. The kind of silence that feels heavier with every second. The daughter sat down at the kitchen table, her hands shaking. She did not know exactly where her mother had been taken. She did not know what was happening in the darkness outside. She only knew why her mother had stepped forward. Hours seemed to pass, even though it had only been part of the night. At some point, the girl began listening for something else. A gunshot. A scream. any sign of what might be happening in the fields beyond the farm. But the night stayed quiet. Finally, just before the first light of dawn began touching the horizon, footsteps appeared outside the house again. The door opened. Her mother had returned, but the story of that night was not spoken aloud. Instead, it would be written down in a way that no one in the family expected. When the door opened, the daughter rushed forward. Her mother stepped inside slowly, her clothes covered with dirt from the fields. The room was quiet. No one asked questions at first. The father simply closed the door behind her and slid the wooden lock back into place. Outside, the Jeep engine started again. Moments later, the vehicle disappeared down the road, leaving the farmhouse in complete silence once more. The mother sat down at the kitchen table. For a long time, she did not say anything. Her daughter stood beside her, unsure whether to speak or remain quiet. In villages like this, people had learned that sometimes silence was the only way to survive the war. But the mother did something unexpected. She reached for a piece of paper. Then, she picked up a pen. Instead of telling the story out loud, she began writing, line by line. Carefully and slowly, she recorded what had happened in the dark field beyond the farm. Her handwriting was neat and steady. Even though the events she described were anything but calm, she wrote about the moment the soldiers arrived. She wrote about the walk into the fields. She wrote about the fear that filled the night and the decision she had made to protect her daughter. Every detail went onto those pages. She did not address the letter to anyone. There was no name at the top. No greeting, only the quiet determination that the truth should exist somewhere, even if it was never spoken aloud. At the very top of the first page, she wrote a single sentence, "So nothing is forgotten." When she finished writing, she folded the paper carefully. The daughter watched from across the table, realizing that the letter contained a story her mother might never tell again. The paper was placed inside a small drawer in the farmhouse. Then, the drawer was closed. And for the next 80 years, that letter stayed exactly where she had left it. The family rarely spoke about what had happened that night. In 1944, accusing the soldiers who had just liberated France was something almost no one believed possible. To the world, the Americans were heroes. And heroes were not supposed to do things like this. In the weeks that followed, life in the village slowly returned to something that looked normal again. The front lines of the war moved farther east, as Allied forces pushed deeper into France and toward Germany. Convoys of trucks continued passing through the countryside, carrying soldiers toward the next battle. For the people in the farmhouse, however, the memory of that night never truly left. The daughter often looked at the small drawer where the letter had been placed. She knew the story was inside it, written in her mother's careful handwriting, but she never opened it. Not then. Not for many years. Her mother never spoke about it again. In many parts of France during 1944, stories like this remained buried in silence. The liberation had brought celebration and relief, but it also created a strange situation for those who experienced darker moments during that time. The soldiers who had arrived were seen as saviors. They had driven out the German occupation. They had helped restore freedom to a country that had lived under enemy control for 4 long years. Because of that, many families felt there was no place to speak about incidents that challenged that image. Even if they tried, who would believe them? In towns and villages across the countryside, people were focused on rebuilding their lives. Farms had been damaged, roads destroyed. Families separated by war were trying to find each other again. The story in the farmhouse became something private, something carried quietly by the people who had been there that night. But the events in that village were not the only troubling stories emerging during the liberation of France. Only a few weeks later, in another small community, not far from the port city of Brest, another family would experience a night that would leave an even deeper scar. Unlike the letter hidden in the farmhouse drawer, this second story would not remain completely silent, because in this case, a witness survived who would remember every detail for the rest of her life. And decades later, she would tell the world exactly what happened. About 30 miles from the first village, Another family was finishing their evening inside a farmhouse when the war returned to their doorstep. It was late in August of 1944, only a few weeks after the liberation had swept through the region. The countryside was still adjusting to life without German patrols and checkpoints. Inside the home lived a father, his wife, and their teenage daughter. Also in the house that night was the younger sister, a 9-year-old girl who would later remember every moment with terrifying clarity. The evening had been quiet until the sound of boots approached the door. At first, the family thought it might be soldiers asking for directions or supplies. It had happened before. Farmers often shared water or food with passing troops, but the knocking that followed was sudden and violent. Before anyone could respond, the door was forced open. An American soldier stepped inside the farmhouse. He was alone, but the rifle in his hands gave him complete control of the room. The father moved quickly, stepping between the soldier and his daughters. Even without understanding the language, he could see the soldier's intention in the way he stared at the teenage girl. The soldier demanded that the girl come with him. The father refused. For a brief moment, the two men stood face to face in the doorway of the house. The father knew he was confronting an armed soldier, but he also knew that stepping aside would mean abandoning his daughter. Then the rifle fired. The sound echoed through the farmhouse walls. The father collapsed in the doorway where he had been standing only seconds before. The younger sister, just 9 years old, watched everything happen from across the room. The memory of that moment would stay with her for the rest of her life. With the father lying on the floor, the soldier turned his attention back to the teenage girl. The night that followed would leave a wound on that family that would take decades to speak about. And for many years, the only person willing to tell the story would be the little girl who had witnessed it all. The 9-year-old girl stood frozen in the corner of the room. In front of her, her father lay motionless in the doorway. Only minutes earlier, he had been standing there protecting the family. Now the house felt completely different, filled with a silence that seemed impossible to break. The soldier forced the teenage girl deeper into the farmhouse. The younger sister would later say that the entire moment felt unreal, like something from a nightmare that refused to end. She remembered the sound of her mother crying, the fear in her sister's face, and the terrible feeling that no one could stop what was happening. When it was over, the soldier eventually left the house. For a long time, the family remained inside, trying to understand what had just happened. The father was gone. The daughter had been attacked. The war that everyone believed had passed through the village had suddenly returned for one terrible night. But in this case, the story did not stay hidden. The young girl who had witnessed everything made a decision that very few people in those circumstances dared to make. She ran to the nearest American military position she could find and reported the crime. At first, many villagers believed nothing would come from the report. During wartime, soldiers moved constantly from place to place. Identifying the man responsible seemed almost impossible, but in this case, investigators were able to track him down. The soldier was eventually identified as a 34-year-old American private. He was arrested by the United States Army and brought before a military court. The charges were severe: murder and assault. Months later, the trial ended with a conviction. The Army announced that justice would be carried out publicly. In February of 1945, villagers were gathered in the town square. Local officials were told to invite civilians to watch the execution. The message was clear. The army wanted to show the people of France that crimes like this would not be tolerated. But behind the scenes, the story of justice during the liberation was far more complicated than it appeared. The execution was meant to send a message. In February of 1945, villagers gathered under a gray winter sky as the American army carried out the sentence. Officers stood nearby. Local officials watched from a distance. The condemned soldier was brought forward, and within minutes the punishment was complete. To the people of the village, the event looked like proof that the army was holding its own men accountable. The message was simple: justice had been served. But as the war ended, and historians began studying the records of that period, a much more complicated picture slowly started to emerge. Years later, researchers working through thousands of pages of military archives discovered documents that raised difficult questions about how these crimes had been handled. Reports from 1944 showed that complaints about assaults committed by Allied soldiers had reached the highest levels of command during the liberation of France. Among the officers receiving those reports was Dwight D., the man responsible for coordinating the Allied campaign across Western Europe. Local French leaders had written letters describing a growing fear among some communities. Villages that had celebrated the arrival of liberating troops were now dealing with incidents that few people wanted to discuss publicly. Over time, historians began to piece together statistics from the archives. Dozens of soldiers had been brought to trial for crimes committed during the liberation period. Some were convicted and punished, sometimes very harshly. But the deeper researchers looked, the more they noticed patterns that suggested the system was not always as fair as it appeared. Many of the soldiers who faced the most severe punishment came from specific units that were easier for investigators to track. Other suspects, especially those moving rapidly with combat divisions, were far more difficult to identify after a crime took place. Because of this, many cases were never solved. And in countless villages across France, families who experienced violence during those chaotic months simply stayed silent. The truth was scattered across archives, hidden inside documents that few people had ever read. But decades later, historians would begin bringing those forgotten stories back into the light. Decades passed. The war ended, Europe rebuilt itself, and the stories of liberation became part of history books and documentaries. For most people, the summer of 1944 was remembered as a heroic moment when Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy and began the long push that would defeat Nazi Germany. But for some families in the countryside of France, those memories were more complicated. In the small farmhouse where the letter had been written, the drawer remained closed for nearly 80 years. The daughter who had watched her mother step into the darkness that night grew older, built a life, and carried the memory quietly with her. Her mother never spoke about it again. The letter stayed hidden, exactly where it had been placed on that early morning in 1944. A simple piece of paper folded carefully, waiting for a time when someone might finally ask what happened. That moment came many decades later. In 2024, a journalist visiting the region began asking elderly residents about the days of liberation. By then, the daughter was 99 years old. She had lived an entire lifetime since that night at the farmhouse. When she opened the drawer and unfolded the paper, the handwriting looked exactly the same as it had the day her mother wrote it. Carefully, she began reading the words out loud. Line by line, the story returned to life. The arrival of the soldiers. The walk into the fields. The sacrifice her mother had made to protect her. Halfway through reading, her voice broke. She paused, holding the paper in her hands for a long moment before speaking again. The memory was still there, after all those years. My mother suffered so much, she said quietly. For decades, the world had celebrated the victories of that war, the battles won, and the armies that marched across Europe. But hidden inside drawers and family memories were other stories too. Stories about ordinary people who endured moments that history rarely records. That is why we tell them here on Clandestine Combat. If this story moved you, take a moment to share it so more people can learn about the forgotten human side of war. And down in the comments, tell us what you think history still hasn't fully revealed about World War II. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that waited the longest to be heard.